Welcome to confirmation class again, and we now move to Paul, one of the most important figure in the New Testament. So, let's start with the video clips for Paul and the early church.
Hello and welcome back to Better Know Your Apostle, the show that takes a closer look at those early church missionaries who spread the gospel of Christ. So get ready to ask yourself, how well do I know my apostle? Today we have Paul, author of a number of letters and texts that would find their way into our Bible today. A real class act of an early Christian. In his lifetime, Paul traveled throughout the Middle East, Turkey, Macedonia, and Greece. And everywhere he went, he spread the word of Jesus as the Son of God and Messiah. This wasn't always popular with people in the places he visited. Being an apostle was extremely dangerous, as there were many people who persecuted the early church. People like this fella here, Saul. Saul was a Pharisee, big sticklers on Jewish law. If Saul thought someone wasn't following those laws, he would do something about it. As you can see, Paul's work in spreading the gospel was no picnic. And if Paul ever did have a picnic, it probably would have been in jail. Still, even the threat of prison couldn't stop Paul from spreading the good news by writing letters. A lot of letters. Letters to churches Paul had visited. Letters that covered how to treat one another and live lives filled with Christ's love. Paul certainly wasn't the only apostle helping build up the church in those early days, but he certainly had a big impact on it. And the early church certainly needed all the help it could get when faced with prison and violence at the hands of its persecutors. Persecutors like Saul. But there's something you should probably know about Saul and Paul. Saul and Paul are the same person. That's right. In his later years, Saul became known as Paul and went from persecuting the church to helping strengthen it. Or did he? So, do you really expect us to believe this, Paul? That one day you're an enemy of all Christians, and the next day you are trying to help lead them? How can any Christian trust you? What if this whole Paul thing is an act, and you're actually trying to take the church down from within? Oh, you had a vision of light and heard Jesus' voice, which led to your conversion. Just like that. Well, I know one thing for sure. This show has certainly made me ask, how well do I know my apostles?
So, Paul and Saul is the same person. Persecutor Saul becomes opposed to Paul. And for Paul, it is really big kind of problem for him. Many oppositions against him made based on this. How I can believe you who are a persecutor. So In many letters from him, he really tried to vindicate himself and how he became, how he can change, how he can transform. And his story for the transformation is Acts chapter 1 verses 1 to 19, and we read it about the last class. So Saul was on the way to Damascus to persecute the Christians at there, but on his way to there, he met Jesus Christ. And his eyes were blind for 3 days, and he was not eating for 3 days. And God sent his servant Ananias to Saul, who was in blind, and he was changed, and he became Paul, who spread out the gospel to the whole world. And here's another reading. In Philippians, it is the letter from the Paul to the church in Philippi. And it's Philippians chapter 3 verses 7 to 11. These things were my asset, but I wrote them off as a loss for the sake of Christ. But even beyond that, I consider everything lost in a comparison with the superior value of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. I have lost everything for him, but what I lost in, I think of the sword of trash, so that I may gain Christ, and be found in him. In Christ I have a righteousness that is not my own, that does not come from the law, but rather from the faithfulness of Christ. It is the righteousness of God that is based on faith. The righteousness that I have comes from knowing Christ, the power of his resurrection, and the participation in his suffering. It includes being conformed to his death, so that I may perhaps reach the goals of resurrection of the dead. So he emphasized that he was changed. What he had before is not valuable, not at all, and he now gained the Christ. So now please turn to page 33 of your textbook. One man and many churches. So Apostle Paul is one of the most influential people in the history of Christian faith. But he didn't start out as a follower of Jesus. To find out how this persecutor of Christians, the Saul, became the most influential missionary of his time, Paul, we need to take a closer look at his remarkable journey. And best of best, who is Saul? Here's a Saul self-introduction, like chapter 3 verses 4 to 6. Though I have good reason to have this kind of confidence, if anyone else has a reason to put their confidence in physical advantage, I have even more. I was circumcised on the 8th day. I am from the people of Israel and the tribe of Benjamin. I am a Hebrew of the Hebrews. With the respect of observing the law, I am Paris. With the respect, devotion to the faith, I harass the church. With the respect to the righteousness under the law, I am blameless. So he has the Jews of the Jew. He was the Hebrew of the Hebrew. He was the number one Pharisee. He thought about himself as the blameless. That kind of enthusiasm became a power for him to persuade the early church. But on the way to the Damascus, everything was changed for him. Now on page 34, here we can see the Paul's journey. And Saul was the way to arrest the Christians on the way to the Damascus. And on his way, he met Jesus Christ. And everything was changed. And Ananias firstly unliked the Saul. And it took time for him to trust that God was at work in this new relationship with Paul. So at the first time, Saul was not fully accepted to the early churches. Saul's beliefs were changed, though, through dramatic encounter with Jesus. Do you think someone has to experience some sort of huge crisis in order to believe in Jesus, or can belief come through the daily contact with the good people? So both are true. Some people's faces grow continually and continually met God, but some people, their faith was based on dramatic change, transformation. And Paul's case was second. And after finally arriving in Damascus and having a sight restored, Saul was hung out with the other Christian followers and started to preach and teaching. And as you can imagine, people were skeptical at first of his intention. This was a guy who had been their enemy only a few weeks earlier. But before long, it wasn't the Christ followers Saul had to worry about. Some of the Jewish leadership was not happy with his saying Jesus was the Messiah. It becomes more powerful. Who was first persuader now becomes follower. When have you had to make a choice that left you unpopular with or even disliked by people you care about? And he now start his mission. In Jerusalem, he met some people, some disciples of Jesus Christ, and he started his first journey as a missionary. Paul and his fellow missionary, Barnabas, hit the Lord preached to the Gentiles. They left the town and traveled to the places. And talking with the preaching anyone who would listen. As usual, they were people who loved what Paul had to say and ended up becoming the followers of Jesus, and others who thought this guy needed to be stopped. So on his journey, he continually met favor and disfavor. And he returned to Jerusalem, and the church was growing quickly, which was great, but it also meant lots of urgent conversations about the ask of the circumcision for the Gentile person. And Paul was kind of vindicated for the Gentiles not to be circumcised because the righteousness of faith, righteousness does not come from the circumcision or the law, but from the faith in Jesus Christ. And after that, he started the second journey, and Paul set out again his second missionary journey, this time with a new partner, Silas. Together they made their way into some new territory, and on their way to Macedonia, Paul and Silas stopped in Philippi, where they were arrested for healing a possessed child. So they continually met kinds of objections, and even they were imprisoned. Why do you think Paul would keep traveling when he kept running into the problems like prisoners? It would be because his encounter with Jesus Christ was so that dramatically and so important for him. It became kind of vocation for him to spread God's gospel. And after he returned to Antioch, and he started the third journey. And in many ways, Paul's third missionary journey was part 2 of his second journey. This time he traveled with Timothy through the Galatians to Ephesus and eventually back to Macedonia and Crete. He actually stayed put in Ephesus for a few years, and he built the church there, healing people and preaching the good news. He even caused a light when challenged some ship business. And Paul eventually arrested at Jerusalem and he now moved to Rome. And Paul had always hoped to go to Rome because at that time Rome was the end of the world. The power center of the Roman Empire. Find out what happened when he got there. Actually, he was arrested, but he has kind of freedom to meet others, and through that freedom, he used it to spread God's gospel. So, Paul's journey wasn't kind of smooth because it was work of God, but it was really dramatically. There was favor from the people, but there was objection from the people. But through the objections like prisoning or in Rome, Paul tried to use them also as the opportunity to spread out God's gospel. Who is this guy? Paul. So, are we talking about the same guy? Well, yes and no. Saul is a Hebrew version of the Greek name of Paul, like Maria and Mary, Philip and Philip. These two versions are fairly interchangeable. In other words, Paul's name change wasn't the rejection of his old Jewish self. It was more like he learned some helpful local praise before traveling to the new place, Gentile places. For them, Paul was more familiar than Saul. Using the version of his name, the Gentile will find familiar was a way of building connections and relationships. So his focus on was how to spread God's gospel to the others. So here's your homework, multitasker. Each one of these items, it is page 36, has a specific use and meet an equally specific need. But all of them have other uses as well. In the space provided, come up with some creative uses for this item. Like Paul was multitasker to spread out God's gospel. And here's questions for you. Whom have you overlooked because they don't seem useful? So Paul was persuader, and in perspective of the followers of Christ, he was kind of not useful, useless. But God choosing him, and he becomes really useful tool for God to spread God's gospel. In the story of the Paul. And next class we will think about Paul's theology. So Paul's thought about God and about God's love. See you next class.